Question of Education seminar series. My name is Dr. Holly Hamilton Bleakley, and I'm the director of the Medieval and Renaissance Studies program here. And so I coordinate this seminar series. In this seminar series, we are studying the medieval university as well as the idea of learning in the Middle Ages as it was practiced and understood within various cultures. And so we hope that this seminar series will generate important conversations and reflections on the purposes of higher education and on how those purposes are carried out in a university system. And of course, we hope it will generate interest in the medieval and Renaissance period and show the immense richness and diversity of this period for helping us gain important insights into our own time and place. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our third speaker for the series, Professor Jonathan Jacobs. Professor Jacobs is professor and chair of philosophy at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a member of the doctoral faculty of philosophy and the doctoral faculty of criminal justice at City University of New York Graduate Center. He's the author of a dozen books and many articles on moral psychology, history philosophy, medieval philosophy, Jewish philosophy, and criminal justice. He received his PhD in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania in 1983 and has been a visiting professor or visiting scholar at numerous institutions, including Oxford, the University of Edinburgh, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the University of St. Andrews. And the title of his talk is Traditions of Learning Outside the University's Jewish and Islamic Intellectual Life During the Middle Ages.
Thanks very much, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about the transmission of Jewish learning and also transmission of Islamic learning during the Middle Ages. And because the form and the ways in which knowledge was transmitted among Jews and Muslims is somewhat different from the sort of institution of the university with which we're familiar in Western Europe in the then Christian world. There's a little bit of background I want to provide, and if it turns out that this is already very familiar to you, just say so and I'll move on from it. But in order to make sense of the transmission of, we'll start with Jewish learning, we need to have a little bit of an idea of the importance of Talmud in Jewish life. And Jews did not have political autonomy anywhere after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70. So they were sort of, in diaspora, scattered pretty far and wide. And what enabled Jews in diaspora to continue to think of themselves as a national community and as a sort of unified people, despite distance and so forth, was their commitment to covenant with God. And the form that commitment took was striving to fulfill the commandments. Now, and when I say commandments, I don't simply mean the 10 commandments, I mean the 613 commandments in Hebrew Bible. Many of them were sort of, their relevance was suspended because some of them concerned priestly functions at the temple and so forth, and there was no longer a temple. But in general, what enabled Jews, wherever they were, to think of themselves as belonging to a national community was their commitment to striving to fulfill the commandments. And Talmud was extremely important with respect to that in the following way, that after the destruction of the temple, what developed is what is generally called rabbinic Judaism. And the sort of core of rabbinic Judaism is oral law, and oral law is a record of the interpretation and the application and the elaboration of the commandments. Talmud is the written version of oral law and includes further commentary, so forth. So it was the possession of Talmud, which, a Talmud in Lithuania and a Talmud in Florence will have exactly the same material and the same commentary in the margins on the very same page. Okay, so that was something that could really be shared in common and became the sort of center of Jewish life rather than the temple. So, as I say, Talmud became a sort of center of gravity for Jewish learning. And in the first few centuries of the Middle Ages, there were three especially significant Talmudic academies. Two of them were in what is now Iraq, and one of them, which was also located in the Middle East, moved, I think, in the 1000s or so to Cairo. But the two that were most important were in Iraq. And the reason I mention them is if you want to try to think of some sort of counterpart to the university in the Christian world, that counterpart would be the Talmudic Academy, because the rabbis at these academies had a kind of authority in the Jewish world that extended, far beyond their own locality. And there was a great deal of correspondence between Jewish communities all over and these Talmudic academies. And another very important part of Jewish life during the Middle Ages was that wherever there was a Jewish community, there was a yeshiva. And a yeshiva was a school for Talmudic learning. So both Jews and Muslims took literacy very, very seriously. And in both cases, it was because it seemed to be required for the study of the traditions and the commentaries and the elaboration of the laws that were crucial to each of those faiths and the integrity of each of those communities. Now, one of the central issues that had a particularly pronounced place in Jewish learning, what was it that was being transmitted in addition to simply what is found in Talmud, and what made the transmission of learning a sort of living project and not simply a passing on of things that had been said earlier? Well, what made it a living project was there was always a considerable amount of thought going into the issue of what is standardly called the reasons for the commandments. I should mention here that there's actually an important distinction between Jewish philosophers and Jewish thinkers more generally. Amongst thinkers more generally were many who were not particularly interested in philosophical arguments and philosophical ideas. Some were quite suspicious of them. There's also mystical traditions in Judaism, so forth. But what I'm focusing on here is has more to do with Jewish learning as understood by medieval Jewish philosophers, for whom this issue of the reasons for the commandments was of very pronounced significance. And the issue was pretty much what it sounds like, namely, one view was that part of what it is to study the law is to try to understand the divine wisdom and benevolence that is reflected in it. And the way to understand the divine wisdom and benevolence reflected in the law is to try to understand the rational justifications for the commandments. So, even commandments that have to do with mixing fabrics or matters of diet or all sorts of things that might not seem at all to be morally significant matters, or that might just seem to be, quite obscure, anachronistic, and probably irrelevant. All of the commandments were studied by numerous Jewish philosophers, striving to understand the reasons for them, because there was an important current of philosophical thought that held that it's an affront to divine wisdom to think that there aren't reasons for all of the commandments. Maimonides is a particularly clear example of this. Sadhya in the 10th century is also another very clear example of this. So within Judaism and in the Middle Ages, there was a debate between what you might call the voluntarists, who believed that it's an affront against divine sovereignty to think that God has to have reasons that we understand for all of the commandments. And then this more rationalistically disposed view that there are reasons, and part of what it is in striving to be holy is trying to understand what those reasons are. And so, for example, with some of them that seem particularly, not to have moral weight, or might just seem somehow irrelevant, people would try to figure out, all right, what is the discipline and what is the virtue that is being encouraged by fulfilling this commandment? The answer is never nothing. You should just do it because God commanded it. The issue, according to this one current of thought, was even if it's non-evident and even if it remains obscure to us, it's important to continue striving to understand what the reasons might be. And amongst the reasons for the commandments, and there's actually a pretty symmetrical counterpart to this in Islamic thought and Islamic learning, there was a distinction made between laws of reason and laws of revelation. The laws of reason were the ones that are more or less evident to us, what the reasons for them are. The laws of revelation are the very large number of commandments where the reasons are not evident, but there are rational justifications. And, as I said, part of the project of striving to lead a holy life is trying to understand what the reasons are. And there's a very, very important sort of braid of mutual reinforcement between cognition and practice in this view. And that braid of mutual reinforcement was widely understood in the following way, that the more disciplined we are about fulfilling commandments in practice, the better positioned we will be to understand the reasons for them. And the more fully we understand the reasons for them, the more dedicated we will come to be in practice and observance and so forth. And that sort of interconnection of mutual reinforcement of cognition and practice was part of what was meant to be transmitted in Talmudic learning in, say, the local yeshiva. The texts that the yeshiva would be using, whether it was Lithuania, Florence, or Cordoba, or Baghdad for that matter, the texts that would be studied might not entirely be exactly the same, but there certainly would be some that were exactly the same. And that's what made it possible for the the hundreds of years of correspondence to be intelligible to the people participating in it, because they were addressing the same commandments, they were addressing the same sorts of questions and concerns and so forth. As I said a moment ago, the study of Talmud was sort of ultimately aimed at better preparing people to lead lives in which they're striving for holiness. And that couldn't be, at least in one widely held view, excuse me, that couldn't be either just a matter of developing the intellect or just a matter of fulfilling the requirements of practice. Okay. When I mentioned at the outset, the tradition of Jewish learning, what I've just been describing in the last few minutes, that's exactly what was at the center of it. And Judaism, like Islam, is in some ways a very jurisprudential sort of religion, in the respect that the notion of law is, and commentary and interpretation of law is vitally important to it. And tradition is a way for the non-evident rationality that is attained by the study of Talmud to be passed on to the next generation. Okay, so it's not as though any particular generation concludes the project of figuring out what all the reasons are, or figuring out what all of the applications of the commandments are. Tradition is critically important, because what is being passed on is, as I said, in addition to the grasp of the laws of reason, whatever understanding of the non-evident rationality of the commandments is. And, it might seem as though there's a sort of analogy between some of the things that Aristotle said about the role of habit with regard to practical wisdom, an analogy between that and what I was talking about when I mentioned this reinforcement between understanding and practice. I mean, Aristotle does indeed seem to have held that, if you haven't been habituated in the appropriate way, you won't come to a prudential grasp of what it is good and bad for human beings to do, and that the understanding depends upon habituation orienting the person so that they're able to see what makes a certain kind of action or a certain practice correct or just and fine, in the way that Aristotle sometimes puts it. That's not the same thing as the notion of tradition. I mean, it may seem obvious to everybody that, sure, habit and tradition, those are two different things. But the reason I want to press this a little bit is sometimes it seems as though people will argue that one of the ways in which tradition is very important is if there isn't such a thing as objective moral understanding, or if there isn't such a thing as genuine practical wisdom, tradition might seem immensely important, because at least that's a way of passing on perspectives, attitudes, practices, ways of being motivated, ways of responding, ways of seeing things. And so, it wouldn't be very surprising for somebody to say, well, actually, tradition is extremely important, because when you haven't got truth in, say, the realist sense or the objective sense, tradition can sort of provide orientation for people, and it can provide a kind of grounding, so forth. But the sort of Jewish thinkers that I've been focusing on in the remarks I've made so far didn't see tradition in that way. They saw tradition as a mode of access to what's true, or, a mode of access to a genuine, rational understanding of the commandments and the reasons for the commandments. So they saw tradition as, upholding various observances, upholding various practices, and so forth, but not simply so that there will be a kind of commonality, not simply so that there will be a memory of who came before us and so forth, but they saw tradition as a mode of access to a sound understanding of, to the extent that we're capable of attaining it, of divine wisdom and benevolence. And the chief means of shaping a tradition and the chief content of the tradition was Talmud. So there's this combination of an emphasis on literacy and an emphasis, at least for boys, at least, of studying Talmud from a very, very young age. As I'm not sure if Maimonides is actually the origin of this or if he quotes it, but there's a saying from one of the rabbis that the Torah is not a spade to dig with. In other words, you don't make your living teaching Talmud. You don't charge people for that. You make a living by working 8 hours a day. You either study and or teach Talmud Torah 8 hours a day, and the rest of the time you sleep. Okay. So there were yeshivas, there were places where people would go for study. And for hundreds of years, there were these important Talmudic academies, but the mode of organization of them and, the ways that they functioned in the community and in the culture are different in some significant respects from universities in the Christian world. I think, part of the difference has to do with Jews not having political sovereignty anywhere. So, for instance, in the Islamic world, madrasa developed in ways that are actually quite similar to some of the ways that universities developed in Christian culture. And there were a number of Muslim rulers who were, keen to support these schools and keen to have places where Quran and the traditions, so forth, could be studied. And so the kind of study that was going on in many of the madrasa was broadly, anyway, similar to the kind of Jewish learning that was going on. The difference was that, many of the Islamic institutions were supported by or, created by various rulers. Now, these rulers sometimes took a pretty strong interest in what was being taught, particularly with regard to the philosophical ideas that were being presented in Islamic schools. And, there are a number of instances of support being withdrawn, or there are a number of important figures in medieval Muslim philosophy who were people who were brought to a particular city and to a particular institute in order to teach, because the way that they understood the religion was congenial to the way that the ruler saw it. But the emphasis on jurisprudence, okay, and the emphasis on the commentary on law, those are really quite similar in the Jewish world and in the Islamic world, and the role of tradition in some ways was also quite similar. Now, there were Jewish thinkers who did sometimes significant work in astronomy, navigational charts. Columbus and Vasco da Gama used navigational charts that had been developed by a Jewish thinker, I believe in Portugal. There were some Jewish thinkers who did work in mathematics. So there is some record of medieval Jewish thought concerning the sciences and concerning logic and mathematics, but in the yeshivas, it was primarily and sometimes exclusively the study of rabbinic Judaism. It was Talmud that was being taught and was being learned. Now, some of the Jewish thinkers had fairly high positions in the Islamic world. In fact, I mean, Maimonides and his family fled Spain because the friendly Muslim regime under which he grew up was replaced by a more sort of extremist regime invading from North Africa, and the Jews had to convert, die, or leave. His family left. They lived in Fez, Morocco for a while. He went to the land of Israel for a brief time during his life, but spent the rest of his life, several decades of his life, in Cairo as a physician to the Sultan. Okay, and also as having a very significant role as an administrator of the Jewish community. And you see that in a number of cases of Jewish philosophers during the Middle Ages, that they had multiple roles. They made a living somehow, and sometimes it was often as a physician. And in a number of cases, it was having a fairly high position in a Muslim regime. So the predicament of the Jews in the Islamic world was, it changed in various ways. It depended a great deal who the ruler happened to be. During the period of the Crusades, a lot depended upon what was going on in the Holy Land and, who seemed to be prevailing there. All of those sorts of things always had very significant implications for Jews. But during much of the Middle Ages, particularly in the parts of the world that were under Islamic rule, a number of Jewish communities, flourished quite notably. And a number of the individuals in them had fairly significant roles. But as I said, things like mathematics, astronomy, navigation, and so forth were generally not included in the curriculum of yeshivas. There's an important sort of counterpart to this relationship between understanding and practice in the Muslim world, okay? And, this issue of treating tradition as a mode of access to truth rather than as a substitute for truth is not very unlike what I've described in Judaism, But again, I should remind us that I'm talking about the more rationalistically minded philosophers, Jewish philosophers and Islamic philosophers. And of course, there were a great many thinkers who were not philosophers. I think this idea of non-rational tradition is helpful because it creates a possibility for a sort of moral epistemology that's not exactly the same as natural law, and it's not exactly the same as practical wisdom either, although it has significant points of contact with both of them. In the study of Jewish philosophy, there's an ongoing and seemingly endless debate about whether in Jewish moral thought there is a role for natural law. Natural law goes without mention by Jewish thinkers until Joseph Albo, I believe in the 14th century, who wrote very briefly about it. He was endorsing the notion of natural law, but he wrote very, very briefly about it, and he is not commented on very widely. In the post-Enlightenment world, and particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, there's a quite lively debate about whether what I was calling the laws of reason should be understood as a Jewish version of natural law. I've been participating in that debate, and I'll just sort of mention to you that my own view of that is that it's important to recognize the points of contact or even a kind of overlap between much of what is included in the laws of reason and what is often understood as a conception of natural law. But I am reluctant to understand Jewish moral thought as involving a version of natural law. And one of the reasons for that is not because so much of it concerns laws of revelation or so much of it concerns requirements for which the rationales are non-evident. Even if we just stick with the ones, the laws of reason that are quite evident to anybody who gives reflective consideration to them, at least the reason I would offer for being reluctant to regard that as natural law is that the commitment to them as right and as obligatory and as vitally important cannot be separated from the notion of covenant. And so if the notion of covenant is really fundamental, that would seem to me to be a consideration in favor of the view that this is not actually a natural law conception, even if it shares a great deal with many natural law conceptions. And, Jewish thinkers like Maimonides had no apprehension about what they called views that are generally accepted. And by generally accepted, they meant all human beings. Okay. And they thought that, many of the most important moral requirements were amongst the things generally accepted, where generally accepted wasn't a matter primarily of tradition, but a matter of, people being human beings being able to recognize the rationale for these things. So, at least for my own sort of academic polemics about this, it's not that I'm anxious to show that the content is nothing like we see in natural law traditions, but that the connection to covenant me put it this way, to have a natural law version of Jewish moral thought that is clearly a natural law version, I think you would have to drop out the role of covenant in the way that it's at least very often understood by Jewish thinkers. And I think that, what I just described is not far off from Maimonides' view. He was very rationalistically disposed, but he also thought that, for example, the Noahide covenant, the Noahide commandments, he thought that the sort of fullest recognition of their rightness and their obligatoriness was not a matter simply of seeing the rationale for them, but recognizing them as commandments with a divine origin, with a covenant with Noah and his family. So, I'm just sort of reminding us that the people that I'm focusing on in my remarks do tend to be the more rationalistically minded of medieval Jewish thinkers. And I also realize that you might be wondering, 613 commandments, where does it say that? And 613 is the number that I think is widely regarded as normative, although there are debates about whether that's exactly the right number. And in order to recognize what they are, you sometimes have to do a bit of interpreting. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 9, verses 5 through 9, the law is telling, the Lord is telling Moses to present the laws to the people and to tell the people, observe them faithfully, for that will be proof of your wisdom and discernment to other people, who on hearing of all these laws will say, surely that great nation is a wise and discerning people. Now, a passage like that can be interpreted as the commandment to study the law, a commandment to try to arrive at a fuller understanding of the justification for this requirement. So to say that there are 613 commandments doesn't mean, if you look real carefully at the text, you'll find, hundreds of times that this is obligatory, or the Lord commanded such and such. In numerous cases, some reading in, some interpretation is required. Now, let me say a little bit more about the study of Islamic law and jurisprudence and the transmission of learning in the Islamic world. There were institutions that were not unlike the universities in Italy and in England and in Spain and in parts of the Holy Roman Empire and so forth. And, I guess like those universities, there was the study of theology, of religious doctrine, but also the study of logic, some study of mathematics and so forth. But again, the sort of center of gravity intellectually in the Islamic institutions was the study of Quran and the study of the traditions that are integral to Islam. I've now talked a little bit about this distinction between laws of reason and laws of revelation and this next point may be one of them where you already are all very familiar with this. So, somebody just yell out enough. But in the Islamic world, there was a distinction between what in English we would call rational theology on the one hand and philosophy on the other. Kalam is the Arabic word for speech, actually, I think. But kalam is the term that was used to describe rational theology, and falasifa for philosophers, and falsafa for philosophy. The distinction between kalam and philosophy was important in Islam and also in Judaism. And the main difference, in a sort of just summary way, is that rational theology, or sometimes it was translated as dialectical theology, starts with accepted premises concerning the religion. And from there develops arguments to defend those premises and to explore the implications of them, and to explore the connections between those implications and the implications of the premises of other bits of theological commitment. The philosophers, in the way that philosophers often do, we're basically claiming that philosophy is more rigorous and more thoroughgoing than dialectical theology, because philosophy takes nothing for granted, or at least, and this is probably, or perhaps a little better way of setting the contrast, philosophy is concerned to arrive at demonstration, proving that certain claims follow with necessity from premises that are known with certainty. That's the sort of paradigmatic notion of demonstration. So I had mentioned a 10th century Jewish thinker, Sadia, who was the head of one of the two major rabbinic academies in what is now Iraq, and is in a way a really sort of key figure for setting the problems of Jewish philosophy during the Middle Ages. Maimonides was critical of Sadia because he said Sadia is engaged in kalam, not in philosophy. That his argumentation wasn't rigorous enough, or there were various things that he took for granted that in fact we are able to prove. Okay. Now, one of the things that Maimonides, sort of an interesting, almost irony about Maimonides, one of the things that he thought that could not be demonstrated is that the world was created. He said, we know this by a sacred text. We know this by revelation. He was impressed enough with Aristotle's arguments, metaphysical arguments, that the world had simply always been, that there was a first cause, but it wasn't a creating cause. It was an explanatory first cause. That he said, well, we know that the world was created via revelation. And then there's a very extensive discussion of the epistemology of revelation. So it's not a sort of blunt claim, then he just moves on to something else. Both Sadia and Maimonides and a number of other medieval Jewish thinkers said quite a lot about the epistemology of revelation and the epistemology as well of tradition. So in both Judaism and Islam, you have this conception that there's a difference between what's rationally evident and what is not. You have this conception that there is tradition that has grown up but there's nothing artificial or merely conventional about tradition. There's an epistemology of tradition that enables us to tell which elements of it, really warrant our full commitment. And tradition centered on interpretation of the law or of the commandments is the sort of core element of Jewish learning and also Islamic learning. Let me just check the time. Yeah, I've gone on for about 45 minutes or so. There's more I could say, but let me stop here, or at least pause here, see if there are questions, comments, observations, anything that anyone would like to discuss. I mean, I ended a little bit abruptly, but what I wanted to do was point out the sort of likeness between some key aspects of medieval Jewish learning and its transmission and medieval Islamic learning and its transmission. But yes.
I'd like to get kind of a big picture question early on. You mentioned that both Judaism and Islam have this aspect of being potentially viewed through the lens of being jurisprudential religions.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, as was mentioned before, I studied Gratian, although that's not Gratian's intention. Gratian thinks of himself as a theologian looking at practical problems.
Right.
The edifice he creates very quickly morphs into a massive jurisprudential system within 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
Do you see similarities? Do you see differences? Obviously, we point out Judaism does not this community not in political power.
Right.
And so therefore not operating that kind of court system. But
that's right.
Islam very much they are.
Yes.
So how would you I guess comparing that as a few traditions in that way?
That's an excellent question, and to give a satisfactory answer to it, I would need to know more about Gratian and about Christian tradition, but I can make a couple of remarks here. One of them is, of course, Jews did not regard the covenant that is reported in Hebrew Bible as having been superseded or perfected in some other way. So for Jews, the law is not something that is an accessory to the theology or something in addition to the basic commitments of the religion. The law is the basic commitment of the religion. And that's a sense in which, on the one hand, I think it's appropriate to describe it as jurisprudential, but not in the mode of brittle legalism. It's jurisprudential in a way that's very open to imaginative interpretation, to how do we handle new kinds of cases and circumstances that we've never encountered before, and so forth. So it's legalism, but not in any sort of mechanical or brittle sense. But I guess, the one thing I feel like I can say here that is at least relevant to responding to your question is that the theology of the revelation that is the origin, the integral origin of Judaism just is the laws that constitute the covenant. And that, I think, is different, from the way that Gratian's laws and the development of that tradition and so forth figured in that culture. Does that make sense to you?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
It's part of the problem of Catholic Christianity is that most of the things you can say, this is a first person statement of Jesus,
Mhm.
don't really live in that world of law and that.
Right.
There's things like that. Yourself, right?
Yeah.
That the practical applications of a statement like that are kind of open to all kinds of interpretation.
Yeah.
They're really looking at sources about, oh, this council laid down these 20 disciplinary canons.
Right.
This church father said, do or don't get married, right? Things
Yeah.
of that nature, it's not coming for the most part out of the primary revelation.
Right. That's right. And, in Judaism, if somebody wanted to find some version of sort of conciliar authority in Judaism, I think the closest you could come is saying something like where I started, namely rabbinic Judaism was anchored in the written version of the oral law, which was the way for the Jews to remain a people in the absence of A, political sovereignty, and B, the temple. But on the one hand, Talmud is always open in that new thoughts can be significant and new kinds of situations and cases occur that we have to address morally and so forth. So there are respects in which, of course, it is very, very open. On the other hand, there's a sense in which Talmud is closed in that there is a normative text, which is the origin text of Talmud, and of the commentators who have been selected as normatively authoritative. And so, if you want to regard rabbinic Judaism as a kind of conciliar institution, okay, but after that, there aren't other stages of it in a formal sense. Yes.
What influence did Jewish law have on laws that follow? Roman law, British common law, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What influence?
Well, the short version is, I'm not sure. The longer version is there's a great deal in Hebrew Bible or Old Testament of moral ideas and ideals that have remained enormously significant in common law, to some extent in Roman law, I think maybe not quite as much. So there's the respect in which to the extent that various ideas and ideals in Judaism resonated, even with a significant difference, but the extent to which they resonated in Christianity, they would thereby, I think, there's the potential for a considerable amount of influence on other traditions of law and later traditions of law and so forth. There's the early modern period of the Christian Hebraists, people like Selden and others of the time who, I think even Milton should be counted among them. There was a brief period mostly in the 17th century, and mainly among English and Dutch thinkers, there was a brief period of numerous thinkers learning Hebrew. I mean, Christian thinkers, in fact, Christian thinkers who had never seen a Jewish person and, didn't know any Jews, but a period during which they learned Hebrew because they thought that Hebrew Bible was a text of enormous political significance. And part of their argument against Spanish Catholicism and the influence of Roman Catholicism and so forth, part of their argument against that, or at least the formulation of an alternative to that, is anchored in, I mean, they are quoting Hebrew Bible all over the place, and they are referring to figures in Hebrew Bible. Harrington is another one. To some extent, Hobbes is. Hobbes thought, gee, one really terrific example of ecclesiastical authority and civil authority being joined in one is Moses. We just have to look at the Hebrew Bible to see that, there's a paradigmatic example of this, and we should consider the potential political significance of this. So, if you reread people like Hobbes, Locke, in Milton, it's very clear. In Harrington, it's very clear. In Grotius, to some extent, and in Selden, certainly. John Selden wrote, I think, a 3-volume work on divorce in the Talmud. Okay, and Milton was interested in rationale for divorce as well. And sometimes they would find it in Talmud. But there was this brief period of early modernity where Judaic ideas were regarded as having considerable political significance, even things like the idea of covenant as the basis for the rule of law. Well, what's social contract? It's covenant as the basis of the rule of law. So, I mean, that's just one example of the kind of thing I'm alluding to here. So, I mean, interestingly or tragically, or however one wishes to view the situation, there was a period where Judaic political ideas findable in Hebrew Bible, in Old Testament, ideas findable there had a very significant role in the development of important parts of the modern world and in the development of important elements of early modern and modern politics. But within a century of that, the perspective on Judaism had changed a very great deal. Enlightenment thinkers tended to regard it as a kind of primitive religion and as anachronistic and so forth. And, if you look at the kinds of things that Kant said about Judaism, they're awful, okay? But nonetheless, the ideas and the ideals had been at work in a pretty important way. So sometimes, this is a long-winded way of saying, sometimes there's profound influence, but not via an obvious pathway. And I think the example I mentioned is one illustration of that. But if you were to ask, how did Jewish law make any difference to law more widely understood between 1200 and 1600? I don't know the right answer to that question, but I'll just mention one other detail, which is Jewish communities, whether they were under Christian rule or Islamic rule, generally were able to have their own courts. And, unless conversion was demanded or expulsion was implemented, Jews lived under Jewish law. And Jewish law was administered by Jewish judges and administrators in their own courts. So in that respect, there may not have been a sort of continuous ongoing flow back and forth, but maybe there was some, I mean, I'm sorry, I simply don't know the right answer to this question. But the ways in which Jews were both alienated from the ruling community, but at the same time able to maintain their integrity, is that they could operate their own courts. Yes.
How does the notion of tradition as a means of understanding the truth manifest itself in the Jewish and Islamic practice of law and study of law?
Well, the people that I mention most frequently, for example, Maimonides, in a very observant Jewish community now, I mean, this afternoon, okay, in the Talmud Torah schools, in the schools for little boys and the yeshivas and so forth, they're studying Talmud, they're studying Maimonides' codification of the law and so forth. Jews, I think in general, the majority of Jews in the contemporary world are not notably observant. They often have a very strong sense of cultural identity and a very strong sense of even upholding various aspects of tradition, but they won't be also studying what are the justifications for these traditions, what actually makes these so important. Whereas in a very observant community, that's exactly what they're doing, okay? And, they are taking the interpretations and the commentary and so forth seriously, not just as the history of ideas, but this is what it is to strive for holiness. And I think actually, I realize I've used that expression a few times and it's been very deliberate, because what I'm going to say next is a little bit of an overstatement, but I think there's an important grain of truth in it, which is, at least for many Jews, and even very important Jewish thinkers historically, the primary aspiration of leading a Jewish life is not salvation, it's holiness. It's striving to walk in God's ways in the world. And how do we do that? We do that by trying to fulfill the commandments and trying to understand what the reasons for them are. Now, of course, everybody that I mentioned also talked about the world to come and so forth, so I don't want to very wrong-headedly sort of exclude that or regard that as merely secondary. But one of the ways I think one can begin to more fully appreciate why law is so important is what I just said, that the religion is fundamentally about striving for holiness, in some ways with more direct interest than the question of what will become of me in the world to come, or is there a world to come? Yes.
To the extent that there's an analogy between Jewish and Islamic learning and the beginnings of the university, it was a kind of common Aristotelian philosophical curiosity about what the rationale is for Jewish law or Islamic law. The question is, how widespread your sense is, how widespread was that in the yeshivot, in the kind of in the Jewish academies,
Right.
the Islamic ones.
Yeah.
Maimonides, obviously, that was crucial. How Maimonidean,
Yeah.
in the sense of concern about what the reason, what rationale for religious and law is, as opposed to what are the details of the law?
Right.
Where exactly is the authority for it? What are the applications of it? How does one aspect of it relate to another aspect of it? None of those are about rationality. All of that's about something else. To what extent do the Jewish academies go for philosophy rather than that second body of knowledge?
Yeah.
Because it's different by region. So Northern Europe is going to be different from the Mediterranean world. And how does it compare to the Islamic Madhab?
Right.
That Aristotelian Maimonidean equivalent in the Islamic world widespread, or is that almost idiosyncratic and marginal?
Okay, I mean, there's a little bit I could say about this. It probably won't be altogether satisfactory, but I do want to make a couple of remarks on your very rich question. And the first thing I would do is, I think the notion of something like Aristotelian rational curiosity, that is something that we find in Maimonides. It is not the prevailing intellectual disposition in the yeshivot, okay? In the yeshivot, the prevailing intellectual disposition is, this is what God requires of us, okay? The metaphysics, it's a waste of time. The study and the appreciation of the law is an endless process. Who's got time for metaphysics? And besides, that kind of curiosity distracts people. And that's the sort of critique that Maimonides was subject to, and is actually subject to some extent now. You know, if you went into a very Orthodox community in, say, parts of Brooklyn, New York, there will be people studying texts of Maimonides who won't even know that he wrote philosophy, because they're studying the Mishnah Torah. They're studying, you know, his works that are directly about the law. And in fact, a few years ago, just in addition to my regular job, I was asked to teach a course at Yeshiva University in New York. Now, it's called Yeshiva University. That doesn't mean all of the courses are about Judaism. That's certainly not the case. But, you know, most of the students are, not all, but most of the students are, you know, of Jewish background. Many of them are more or less observant. Those students had all read Maimonides before coming to college. None of them had read any of his philosophical works. Okay. Anyway, so the very conception of a kind of Aristotelian rational curiosity is not at home in the yeshiva, and that's why I kept saying, you know, I'm mostly talking about the philosophers here, because it is at home with them. And, you know, Sadia wrote a great deal, and in fact, he even wrote some prayers that are still part of Jewish liturgy and so forth. This, you know, a 10th century thinker. Anyway, in his largest philosophical work, that's translated as the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, the first few chapters are epistemology. And they are really, really interesting epistemology about the relationships between sense perception, rational self-evidence, and what is transmitted to us through the testimony of tradition. And he takes these issues extremely seriously and goes into considerable depth regarding them. That wouldn't be found in, you know, most yeshiva study. So, you know, as I say, I think it might be helpful to distinguish the kind of intellectual curiosity. You know, I'm a bit embarrassed about this, but remind me of the other main point of your question.
differs by region.
Ah, okay, yeah.
So then you go to
yeah.
and
Yeah, I mean, this is something we, we would need to check by looking at the relevant historical sources, but at least my understanding thus far is that in parts of the Islamic world, sometimes for hundreds of years at a time, the predicament of the Jews was less vulnerable than in many parts of the Christian world. And so in Sura and Pumbedita, in what is now, Iraq, you get these rabbinic academies that lasted for hundreds of years, that produced works that in the Jewish world are enormously significant and still normative for people who are very observant and so forth. And, I mean, in ultimately, in every part of the Islamic world, the predicament of the Jews became precarious, and there were changes and expulsions and so forth. But I think, for example, I wrote a book a dozen years ago called Reason, Law, and Morality in Medieval Jewish Philosophy. And it didn't even occur to me until after I finished it that all of the thinkers I was focusing on were Jewish thinkers in the Islamic world. Okay, I was writing about Bakhia, Sadia, and Maimonides. So Persia, even more so, Iraq, to some extent, Egypt, in various periods, the Holy Land, that is the part of the world, and Iberia, when it was, at least for a lengthy period, when it was under Islamic rule. I think that the flourishing of Talmudic study and wisdom that was critically important to the continued existence of the Jews through the Middle Ages mostly originated there. Okay. Later on in Provence and in Germany, and then in the modern world in Lithuania and parts of Poland and so forth, there were very, very important centers of Jewish learning. But I would be willing to suggest that, say, from 700 to 1200, it was Jews in the Islamic world that were the sort of key origin of Jewish thought. Something else I think I wanted to mention about that. I can't remember what it is. Anyone else? Yes.
So, I wanted to ask a little about your comment about how natural law, you think that the law of reason is in some ways not comparable to natural law because covenant is so important. So I'm not, a philosopher or a theologian. I have the impression that in the Christian tradition, covenant is more important on the voluntary side of things. Natural law is more on the rational side of things. The voluntary side is kind of like where God can do whatever he wants. It's not, right. And therefore the only way we can really relate to God is through covenant. He right. promises to do certain things, and that then we can rely on that. Okay. We wouldn't have anything, related to it. So, right. but you were saying that you don't think there's, at least there's a similarity because of the idea of covenant. Although you're talking about the rational side of Jewish law, and that just seems to be a little incongruous. Yeah, I'm just curious about. Okay,
I mean, and here I'm just sort of thinking out loud in a somewhat fumbling way, but let me try out a couple of responses. I mean, I was emphasizing the likeness between Judaism and Islam with regard to amongst the rationalistically disposed thinkers, the similarity with regard to the importance and the role of tradition. Okay, now, summarizing in a cartoonishly swift and simple way, the rationalist disposition in Islamic thought, and certainly in Islamic philosophy anyway, sort of ground to a halt after Ibn Rushd. After Averroes, the voluntarists, the Sufis, and other non-rationalistically disposed Muslim thinkers prevailed in a way that has lasted for centuries. And, you know, Islamic Aristotelianism, it's not as though it's been forgotten, but it did grind to a halt, okay? Now, right, I mean, covenant, I can see how covenant could be extremely important to someone who has a voluntarist view of divine requirement. I mean, that's part of what you were saying, yeah. And I think it's actually very, very helpful to point that out. Although, and you know, I'm happy to be argued out of this, but it seems to me that one of the things that comes with natural law that doesn't come with covenant plus tradition, even if they are understood in broadly rationalist terms, one of the things that comes with natural law is universality. And so you can have a covenant or even a sort of voluntarist conception of what imperatives there are for us that might be very rationalistically inflected, but if it's covenant, then it doesn't automatically have the sort of universalization, I think, that's crucial to conceptions of natural law. You know, I mean, are there natural law thinkers who are merely local, so to speak, or are, you know, local to a particular tradition? And, you know, I don't feel the need to sort of stubbornly dig in on this, but it does seem to me, for example, and I won't go on much longer about this, but there are a number of contemporary Jewish philosophers, very, you know, very sophisticated thinkers, who argue that we can even find basically Kantian elements of morality in Jewish moral thought. And this is a way of recognizing the universal validity of these elements of Jewish moral thought. For a couple of reasons, I think it's a very serious mistake to try to Kantianly interpret Judaism, simply because Kant doesn't have a conception of the reality of God, and has a conception of religion that is just sort of radically different from Judaism and Christianity and Islam. But anyway, what the universalizing would do is, if not render irrelevant, it would so overshadow covenant that that would no longer be integral. And that's what I'm sort of digging in a little bit on. Yes.
Today, it seems to be what I call religious extremists
Mhm.
who are trying to criminalize people's behavior.
Mhm.
What's Jewish law? And I'm worried about same-sex people, same-sex marriage, and even what's the Jewish law?
Well, you know, as you would expect, if you read the works of 7 different Jewish thinkers, you'll see that there are 11 views. You know, I mean, it's always an argument. And I mean, that's an old sort of joke about Jewish views, but it's not merely a joke in the sense that part of the tradition of the study of Talmud is that it is always done with partners. One never studies alone. And that's because the study of it is essential to the study of it that it is a dialogue, and that it is a dialogue in which people can illuminate each other's thinking, correct mistakes and so forth. And the Hebrew word, I think, is havruta. Your havruta is the small group of people with whom you study Talmud. You never study Talmud, according to the tradition, by yourself. It's always a group of 2 to 5 people. And that's almost, I mean, in a way, that's almost a way of saying there's almost certainly going to be more than one opinion about things, or things are open to interpretation in various ways. And if you look at the contemporary literature on Jewish ethics and morality, on capital punishment, on abortion, on sexuality, and other issues of real contemporary interest and importance to people, the views are very diverse, although I think, as we would expect, the views of the Orthodox tend to be much closer to what you find in the text of, of Scripture. Although with one sort of important addendum, there is a movement called modern Orthodoxy. And modern Orthodoxy is an attempt to sustain the integrity of, sort of genuine, committed to the covenant Jewish life, but in ways that are responsive to realities of the modern world that are very different from the way things were 800 years ago, 1,500 years ago. You said that now there seem to be so many extremists. Well, amongst American Jews, conservative Judaism is just about disappearing. Orthodoxy is growing, and Orthodoxy, some of the groups among the Orthodox are modernizers, but many groups among the Orthodox are not. They are very, very traditional in their views about sexuality and family and education and so forth. And Reform Judaism is growing, which is a sort of a version that, well, it's very plastic. There are 150 different versions of Reform Judaism, but it's a way of being Jewish that takes being part of the people very, very seriously, but doesn't involve fulfilling the commandments very extensively. And so-called conservative Judaism, if you grew up in a conservative Jewish household, like I did, for example, you learned Hebrew, and you had a bar mitzvah, and you continued your learning after that, and you went to Sabbath services, and you observed various of the holidays, but you didn't make observance and worship what your whole life was about. And there are people who do. And they think they're getting it right. So this is a roundabout way of saying you're right. Even among contemporary Jews, there's the extremes are growing, and the middle is shrinking. And amongst numerous Jewish thinkers, that's a very worrying issue, for reasons that aren't terribly difficult to imagine. 3 years ago, I was invited to contribute to an issue of the journal Daedalus, which I guess is the journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I think it's a quarterly. And the issue was focused on religion and democracy in America. And, I told the editor that I was flattered to have been asked, but I certainly wasn't the right guy to write the article on Judaism. There were people with considerably more expertise. but he said, give it a try. Let's see how this goes. Anyway, I ended up writing the article. And then when the issue came out, he contacted me and he said, all of the other articles, like 6 or 8 or something, were basically about constitutional issues, religion and, the interpretation of the law, the Constitution. He said, you were the only person who wrote about what people of a certain faith tradition believe, that had religious content to the discussion. And I thought, well, how can you have a discussion of, Judaism and if you don't talk about the substance of Judaism? But a reason for mentioning that is that I think in academia, at least for a great many people, I don't want to say most people, or certainly don't want to say everybody, but among a great many academics, the only way in which religion is interesting is as a social problem or a social question or a legal issue. And they're perfectly comfortable knowing very little about what the actual religious traditions and perspectives and commitments and so forth are. That's happening in modern Judaism as well. But Holly and I were talking about some issues in the neighborhood of this yesterday, and we were remarking on how so much of the analytic philosophy of religion in English during the last 75 years is clearly written by people who don't know anything about religion. They know about the validity of arguments, but what we need are some more dialectical theologians, maybe, and not just philosophers. Yes.
Idea of contemporary Jewish thinker and philosopher who identifies Judaism with communism. Who would that be?
David Novak. To some extent, Len Goodman. And Len is a friend of mine, and David is a man I've met and corresponded with, and so forth. And I appreciate their work a great deal, but I'm particularly critical of Novak on this, because I really do think that trying to identify and highlight recognizably Kantian elements is a way of taking God out of the picture, frankly. And why would David Novak want to do that? He's quite serious about his religious commitment. Should we stop?
I think we're at 5:30.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming and
Oh, you're very welcome.
presentation and more aware of my ignorance than ever before. No, that's good time to do talk. But thank you very much for coming as well.
Yes, thanks, everybody.